Okay, everybody, I'm going to try to do this the 1450 to 1750 maps. I'm going to try to do all of them in one video. Let's see how it goes. Now, in common terms, we talk about this period in world history as an age of exploration. We really have to qualify that to be an age of European exploration, keeping in mind that other civilizations in Africa, highly developed civilizations in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, have been exploring forever. Okay, so now Europe is finally kind of catching up, and in the process is going to not discover, but link for the first time the old world, Afro-Eurasia, to the new world, which is the Americas. So what this first page shows you is just a very brief visual overview of European expansion. Notice it indicates exactly where each country is going to and settling in. I want you to keep in mind, however, that here in Africa and in Asia and Oceania, in the old world, there's a difference because the Europeans, as they expand into the old world over here, they're going to come into contact with very powerful empires in all those parts of the world, and they're going to be kept to the coast because of that. Kept to the coast, they're only there for trade. Who really still has control and power? All of those wonderful really rich, developed, complex civilizations that exist in Africa, in Asia, Middle East, Oceania, and so forth. So Europeans, even though they're being shown there, they have very little power at the time. They are just there on the coast in these minor trading settlements. They do not dominate. In the New World, however, it's totally different. When they are coming over, they are encountering the Native Americans, and for the most part, they are either forcibly removing them, enslaving them, or trying to work with them but convert them to Christianity. So you have much more domination on this side of the world, and over here you are not able to have that kind of domination because, frankly, Europeans are not that strong, and they cannot take over the powerful West African, East African trade centers, nor the trade empires that exist in India, the Middle East, Oceania, and China. Okay. The other thing I want to draw your attention to on this page is that we have down here all of the kind of big ideas that are going to become part of this entire unit. So triangular trade, mercantilism, mother country relationship, Columbian exchange. These are our big ideas for this unit. And as I talk through the other pages, we'll come back to those. You might on this page, I did not, but you might want to get down just briefly what these are. We will come back to them, but in different ways throughout the rest of the pages. Okay, let's go down to the next one. Here we have an image of the Mediterranean. We're including North Africa here, parts of the Middle East, Russia, and then all throughout Europe, both East and West Europe. Where we want to start is I want to take you through chronologically the changes that are occurring in Europe, Middle East, and so forth, and then look at some of the effects that those are going to have. So we want to start down here, though, and refresh our memories as to who controls the Mediterranean at this point in time. So if you remember, there are three sectors. Down in North Africa, the southern portion of the Mediterranean, the majority of the Mediterranean is being controlled by the Muslims. So they are controlling all of the African trade routes. So they control all of North Africa, the southern part of the Mediterranean. So they're blocking Europeans from going out down into Africa and becoming involved in those. Then up here, you have Europeans controlling this region of the Mediterranean trade. So this is Catholic dominated. The Pope, of course, and all of these important trade cities in Italy, like Venice, Milan, things like that. And then over in this sector, you have the Byzantines, who are controlling this area of the Mediterranean, at least until 1453. So to recap, you have three zones of trade. You have the Muslims controlling the southern portion, you have the Christians controlling this section, and you have the Greek Orthodox controlling this section in Byzantium. Now, in 1453, this is a trigger point for us. 1453, the Byzantine Empire is going to fall. Byzantine Empire, even though it did not have a perfect relationship with the rest of Christian Europe, because it does represent a different sect of Christianity and they were in competition with one another, the Christians in Europe had always kind of envisioned the Byzantines as an ally. The Byzantine Empire controlled Constantinople, which was the end of the Silk Road and the entry point for all those Silk Road goods into the Mediterranean, Africa, and Europe. When Byzantium falls, the Byzantine Empire had always allowed those goods over into Europe. When it falls and the Ottomans take over in 1453, the Europeans are going to be forced to find other routes to access goods from India and from China, because now the Muslims dominate and control the Silk Road, and they are going to block them off from access to the Silk Road trade routes. This is going to trigger this major transition in European history, which is going to be Atlantic exploration. We discussed this earlier in the school year, the fact that the Mediterranean is the first body of water where extensive trade routes develop. It makes sense because it's small, things are close together. It's a lot less risky to be venturing out into the middle of the Mediterranean on boats. The second body of water will be the one that we discussed first this school year, which was the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean, similar to the Mediterranean, has a lot of coastal areas. It kind of has a natural geography that is surrounded by all of these major civilizations. So the Indian Ocean is the area that develops next. Mediterranean first, Indian Ocean second. What the fall of Byzantium and the rise of the Ottomans in 1453 is going to do is it's going to shift a lot of that trade from the old world, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, to the Atlantic. And in doing so, it is going to force people out further and further into the Atlantic Ocean, ultimately culminating in the discovery in air quotes, discovery of the New World, which is the Americas, and for the first time permanently linking the two together. Keep in mind, we do know that Malay sailors most likely had come to the Americas very early on, and then after them, the Vikings had temporarily come to the Americas as well as explorers. This, of course, is not negating the fact that people had crossed the land bridge between Russia and modern-day Alaska and had populated the Americas thousands of years before that. But for the first time, the two hemispheres will be brought together by the European exploration that we're looking at in this section of world history, period 4, within the AP curriculum. So we have the fall of the Byzantine Empire. We have Europeans being forced to explore. First two countries to do so are going to be Portugal and Spain, and Portugal is prior to Spain, so we're going to start with Portugal first. Portuguese information is over here, as you can see, and Portugal and Spain are going to be the first to explore because they are on this peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, that kind of juts out into the rest of, well, it juts out into the Atlantic. It positions them very well to be the first to explore via sea. Henry the Navigator is going to be the individual in Portuguese history who's really prompting an exploration of the Atlantic. Unlike his father, who had wanted, his father's reaction to the rise of the Ottoman Empire and fall of the Byzantines was actually to militarily continue to fight in the Mediterranean. His son, Henry the Navigator, decides that old way of doing things is wrong. It's not going to be successful. So he's the one that shifts attention to the Atlantic. And what he does is, because they are in the Iberian Peninsula, they had the impact from the Muslims for so long, they have all of that Islamic knowledge. They're going to take all of that new technology and use it to create new and better ships and navigational tools. So this is where we see a combination of a lot of the Chinese and Arabic knowledge into a new type of sailing vessel, the caravel, which is going to incorporate both square and Latin sails. You see new compasses and astrolabes developing during this period in time as well. And the school that Prince Henry the Navigator develops is what's going to actually advance a lot of the shipbuilding, the technology for navigation, as well as map making. That's going to make it possible for Europeans to explore the Atlantic Ocean successfully. The Portuguese are particularly going to settle in Africa and in Brazil. Africa deliberately, Brazil by mistake. And when we get to those other maps, we'll talk about that in more detail. I'd like to go right down to Spain. Spain is also among the first to explore. When it explores geographically, it's going to focus on Latin America and Mesoamerica. The mistake of Spain early on is that it doesn't develop its own commercial infrastructure, so it doesn't have the type of schools that Portugal is going to have, nor does it have the type of commercial developments like the Dutch, like the Netherlands will later on. For example, joint stock companies, the insurance programs that they develop, banking systems, commercial stock exchange, currency exchanges, things like that. So the Spaniards, when they get involved, they rely on the work of other people to actually stimulate their exploration. And they never develop or maintain power over any of those aspects on their own. And this eventually is going to lead to their decline. We also need to know the importance of Ferdinand and Isabella. At this point in time, remember the context from the previous period, 600 to 1450. You have monarchs and you have the church in Europe, and they are constantly battling out for supremacy. Well, one way that the monarchs begin to see that they can gain an upper hand is that they have control of enough income that they can pay for these voyages of exploration. And they're finding that the voyages of exploration are paying off quite handsomely when they find gold and when they find silver. So more and more kings and queens are wanting to support and pay for these voyages, which are very risky, but at this point they are assuming all of the risk. The kings and the queens are assuming all of the risk. This is giving them great power. And Ferdinand and Isabella are going to have the foresight to actually fund the expedition that Columbus proposes. Now remember why Columbus has to propose it to Spain and not to his native country. Portugal did not need to explore the Atlantic, which is what Columbus was proposing, because it had already found a way around Africa. So it had a route to China and India. Spain did not. So when Columbus goes to Spain to ask for funding, he's going to say and kind of argue that, well, you need to find a way to beat the Portuguese. Portuguese have found a way around Africa. I'm proposing we go out into the middle of the Atlantic, and I bet there's a shorter route. And Ferdinand and Isabella are willing to take the risk to find out, because if there is a shorter route, the payoff is going to be immense. And then finally, this is the period when monarchs start to fund these explorations. The monarchs start to gain a lot of power, and you see the idea of the absolute monarch begin to form. And Philip II is our example of an absolute monarch in Spain. Remember El Escorial, his palace, and how that represents his power through the grand architecture. But also we have to remember with Philip II, the issues he's going to have later on with England. So Spain is a very powerful empire initially. They control the Netherlands, they control parts of the Netherlands and other regions. And when rebellions are going to happen in those other areas, who's going to come to their aid but England and Queen Elizabeth? This is going to anger Philip II, and he's going to send his Spanish Armada, which at that point is the most powerful navy in the world, to England. England, because of dumb luck, a storm, is going to be able to win this and emerge as the most powerful sea power in the world at that point because of the destruction of the Spanish Armada. So there are a lot of political intrigues back and forth during this period, but sea power versus land power is starting to have a significant impact on whether a country in its entirety is going to gain or lose power over time. So the other thing to remember with Spain is that Philip II does respond to Queen Elizabeth's helping of other Protestants in the northern part of Europe with sending his armada, and that armada is defeated. Okay, so that's Portugal and Spain. That's our initial phase of European exploration. Now, I want to pause for just a moment before we get to the second phase, where we'll look at France, the Netherlands, and England, and I want to talk about some of the big ideas. So first, mercantilism. Remember what that is. Mercantilism is going to develop and really have a focus on gold and silver. Now, what do I mean by that? There are 3 goals to mercantilism that particularly Spain and Portugal are going to adhere to, but you're going to see France, Britain, and the Netherlands try to adhere to it as well. The goal in exploration, the goal of mercantilism, is to hoard as much wealth as possible, and at this point, wealth meant gold and silver. There was a general conceptualization that only the seller benefited from trade. If you bought something, you would be buying it with your gold and silver, and therefore you wouldn't be able to hoard it, thus making you weaker. So there was a desire to export more than you imported. Now, it was really hard to maintain that, particularly if you were not focusing on production, if you were focusing on mining instead. And so this is a system that's flawed from the beginning and is going to lead to certain countries kind of advancing while the others decline. Mercantilism with a lot of commercial infrastructure is going to be kind of the second phase that's going to develop, and that's going to be more with what happens with France, the Netherlands, and with England, and we'll come back to that. Here's the other thing that I want to mention before we move on. The colony-mother country relationship that we see up here. I want you to remember how that works. Remember the game, the scenario that we did, where some of you were mother countries, others were colonies, and the unfair relationship that created. So the mother country generally had total power, total control. The colony, on the other hand, was a source of 3 things. First, a source of cheap labor. Second, a source of raw materials. And keep in mind how small European countries were in comparison to others. So they needed more land for the raw materials and so forth. And then finally, colonies were a market for the finished goods of the mother country. Mother countries prohibited manufacturing in the colonies, forcing those colonies to buy their finished goods. And then finally, you could only trade with the mother country. Colonies could not trade among themselves. And this system was completely stacked against the colonies, so that colonies have one purpose: it's to support and grow the wealth of the mother country, and that is it. So that's a general overview of what's happening with the colonies and mother country structure. One more thing before we go on. I want to draw your attention to these things in the middle. These are big ideas that are happening throughout Europe at this point in time. When Spain and Portugal find the Americas, particularly Spain, when Spain finds the Americas, and then Portugal later with Brazil, accidentally, this initiates the Columbian Exchange. By far in all of world history, this is the largest exchange of plant, animal, and disease ever. Remember the impacts of this. For the old world, the impact is going to be a population increase. Of course, for the old world, population decrease. More repercussions. With the influx of gold and silver, you're going to see inflation. This is going to lead to a price revolution. Prices in Europe continue to inflate or get higher, but the wages remain the same. This is going to create pressure on people to get out of Europe because the economic situation is not good. That's going to lead to more colonization in the Americas. Next, absolute monarchs are gaining support and power through supporting exploration. And finally, once the New World is discovered, once people start to colonize, there is a race to colonize the world. So there is intense competition in Europe at this point, competing for colonies and the potential of finding gold and finding silver. Remember, that's what everybody wants. Okay, so those are the big ideas. Now let's go to the second phase of colonization. So first phase of colonization was Portugal and Spain. Second phase will be the Dutch, then the French, then the English. So let's do the Dutch. So the Dutch are an early sea power. You can see why. They're also on a peninsula that juts out. Not sure the name of that one. We could probably look that up. But so they're an early sea power. However, in comparison to the others, you can see here that they ultimately end up being too small to compete. outside of that, the Dutch really don't have a downfall. They don't have anything negative that they're doing. In fact, everything that they're doing is really, really smart and innovative, perhaps the most innovative out of anybody. So they're going to be the first in Europe to develop these highly advanced commercial infrastructures like the joint stock company. Now, remember what the joint stock company does. This is what is going to replace the supporting of exploration by absolute monarchs. Over time, particularly after the voyage of Magellan, when almost all the ships were lost, Magellan is killed, so few of the crew return. Monarchs are going to realize that these explorations, even though they are highly beneficial if successful, that they're a big risk, and that if something fails, they lose all of that money. What develops and what they allow to develop instead, this is initiated by guilds and by merchants, is something called a joint stock company. And this is the precursor to modern stocks in companies. The idea was that you would open up, you would create a company, and then sell different stocks to people who might want to invest in that particular sea voyage. If that sea voyage was successful, then everybody got a portion of whatever came back from it after the king took whatever he was taking. So the monarch got the majority, but then what was left, the remainder, was split up between the stockholders. And many of them were quite successful, and so people made great fortunes. However, the real benefit here was that if a voyage failed, everyone within that joint stock company only lost the portion that they had actually invested. So say everybody invested $5. The most you could possibly lose was $5. So the idea behind a joint stock company is that it spread out the risk. And this was a major innovation, because once you have this happening, imagine how many more explorations you can fund because people are willing to. So it increases the amount of exploration that is taking place. The other thing that the Dutch develop is an insurance company, so you can insure the money that you are investing so that if something does go down, the insurance company would pay you back for it. And of course, they'd be making a healthy profit along with. The Dutch are the first to create a banking system in Europe that allows you to exchange currency as well as other things. They're the ones who are building boats for everybody else, and then they create the first stock exchange, which is the Beurs. So there's so many things that the Netherlands is actually developing that's going to pave the way for, in particular, modern day capitalism. After the Dutch decline, though, particularly due to their size, that they're too small to compete, we see France coming into play with exploration. The French, though, unlike others, are trying to expand via land-based trade routes. In particular, they're trying to get in on what the Ottomans are doing. So they're going this direction via land, trying to impact some of the Ottoman trade routes. And at the same time, they're exploring overseas and getting involved in the Americas and in the Indian Ocean, getting involved in India over here. So France is trying to do everything, land-based and sea-based. And they're going to get into conflicts with a lot of the other European nations because of that. So they're entering into a lot of competitive wars over time. The most significant by far is going to be the 7 Years' War, the war that they have with England. It's going to be fought. It's one of our first world wars. It's going to be fought in India. It's going to be fought in Europe. It's going to be fought in the Americas. We know it as the French-Indian War. But the 7 Years' War is going to severely overextend the French. On top of that, the French lose. And when they lose their colonies in India. They lose some of their colonies in the Americas. So it's a major blow to the French and one of the reasons why they decline. The last thing you want to know about the French, just in general, is Louis XIV. And he is by far our best example of an absolute monarch, where you have divine right. So the right to rule is coming from God, and absolute power. It's encapsulated in his phrase, "I am the state," and this whole idea of him being the Sun King. And you can go back and look at that PowerPoint on Versailles and Louis XIV. And then finally, let's get to England. England, when it explores, it's going to become, as I mentioned earlier, a major sea power. Makes sense because it's an island. You do have confrontation early on with the Spanish. in the Spanish Armada, and Queen Elizabeth supporting the Dutch, who were also Protestant, just like England was, against Catholic Spain. So you do have some early problems with warfare, potentially overextension, but because of luck, England does win those battles. They develop a commercial infrastructure, and here's really where they start to take over supremacy in Europe. They take everything that the Dutch had done, and they copy it, but then they make it better. This is the one lesson that I hope you learn by the end of the year, is that isolating yourself, focusing on your own country's benefit is always the wrong decision. Well, not necessarily the wrong decision, but isolating yourself is always the wrong decision, because you stay embedded in the past. The most successful nations all throughout world history are those that have been watching very carefully what the rest of the world is doing, taking from the best of those, and then building upon it and making those things even better. So the countries that survive are the ones that are copying and looking to the future and constantly changing and adapting. Those that want to stay in the past or go back to the way things were are always the ones that are on the beginning of a decline. And you see that with England, and you see that with the other countries as well. Those that get stuck in the past and continue with mercantilism are the ones that are going to fail. Those that are copying from the best and then improving upon it are the ones that are going to succeed. So we see the joint stock company taking even a further form when it is developed in England. So it's much more sophisticated than what we saw among the Dutch. We see the banking system becoming more sophisticated as well, and the currency, whereas the Dutch would just exchange currencies, the English made a standard currency that now everybody wanted to adopt and use because it provided a stable means of exchange. So the commercial infrastructure really is going to put England on top, along with, and you can see here, their practice of mercantilism, but with a focus on production as opposed to a focus on gold and silver, as you see down here. So this is Europe in the beginnings of exploration. Let's move on and see how things play out in North America. So in North America, we have 4 groups who are at play here. We have the Spanish coming over first, then we have the Dutch, then we have the French, then we have the English. So the Spanish down in the lower portion here, what we're going to see is that Spanish colonization in Mexico and the Caribbean is going to take advantage of those weak city-states. So they come over and encounter a situation where Tenochtitlan is very much disliked by the other city-states that are around them. They have been dominating those other city-states as the Aztec Empire. So the other city-states, when the Spaniards come in and say, hey, will you help us overthrow the Aztec? The other city-states are like, absolutely, we hate those guys. And so there's a lot of internal division already in the city-state structure, and the Spaniards take advantage of that. However, it's arguable that the Spaniards would not have succeeded if it were not for the impact of disease in the Columbian Exchange. So unlike the potatoes and other crops going to Europe, leading to the increase in population, when the Spaniards and other Europeans come to the New World, they bring disease, which the people in the Americas do not have immunity to, and it ends up killing. Estimates are anywhere from like 50 to almost 90% of the population. And that disease is really what kind of gave the Spaniards the edge, so that with very few people, they were able to take over the Americas. So it's a combination of the internal divisions and agency on the part of the people who are living in the Americas already. I mean, granted, Spaniards probably never would have been able to succeed against the Americans if those city-states didn't turn on the Aztecs. So it's agency on the part of the people who didn't like the Aztecs anymore, disease, which is just kind of dumb luck in the Columbian Exchange, and then also some better weapons and technology on the part of the Europeans. But really, that's the most minor factor coming into play here. The two are really the decision of the people there to turn against their leaders and help the Spaniards, and then diseases as well. Remember who's coming over first. So there are a couple phases. We have first the conquistadors, who are your fighters. We have the merchants, of course, they're always present. We have government in the form of viceroys, these are your governors and so forth. Then we have missionaries. Also, remember during this earliest phase, these are predominantly single men, so there's a lot of intermarriage with native women, leading to mixed groups like mestizos. Later during the second phase, once things are stabilized, then you have families coming over. Now, once that occurs, you have a whole series of changes taking place. So you have forced labor systems being put into play. And remember what the Spaniards' view of the native populations was. It was to exploit them for their labor, whether that be in mines or on plantations, growing sugar predominantly. So you have the encomienda system developing. This was a virtual form of slavery. It was very vicious, very hard work. They often worked slaves until they died. You have people like Bartolomé de las Casas, who is a missionary, a Spanish missionary who is coming over observing things, writing critiques of what they're doing to the native people. He's a religious man, of course, and he sees that this is unchristian. And so the Spaniards eventually give up the encomienda and go to the repartimento. Now, the repartimento, you don't have to work the entire year. It's a little bit less rigorous, but still it's very, very exploitative. And once again, receives critiques, is very harsh. You have slaves dying. And so then eventually they're going to go to the hacienda system. Now, the hacienda system is a plantation system. People get a wage, but it's almost like sharecropping, or what we just talked with the Industrial Revolution, tenant farming. It's very much like tenant farming in that you're working somebody else's land. They deliberately get you as far into debt as they can so that you can't leave. And by this way, they actually create almost like a slave labor force. It's not slavery, but I mean, it's almost like a slave labor force. You're trapped. You can't escape unless you run away. Slave trade. So the native population, when it dies, that's what's going to lead to the importation of slaves from Africa. Had the native population lived and the Spaniards been able to take them over, which who knows if that would have been possible. Had that happened, though, African slave trade might never have existed. But because of the decrease in the native population, they have to go somewhere for cheap labor, and so they import them from Africa. Why Africa? A slave trade already had existed there. So remember, they were selling slaves to the Arab world. So it was already established there. They were just tapping into a pre-existing system. It's not like Europeans created it at all. They just tapped into a system that was already there. And most of the slaves coming over to Spanish America were going to the Caribbean, which you can see I have marked over here where it says sugar. So most of them are coming over and working in the Caribbean. And to this day, we have a very large Black population in that part of the world, which originally had come from Africa. We also have some triangular trade. So later, when the Brits become involved, they're going to establish triangular trade. Slaves are going to be coming in. Raw material and luxury goods are going to be going out. So slaves coming in from Africa, raw materials and luxury goods going back to the mother country. And then finally, just remember the things that are being exchanged between the old and the new world in the Columbian exchange. So that we have food items, of course, the potato being the most significant of them, sweet potato as well. We have animals. Animals are more significant for the Americas. We have the importation of the horse. We have the importation of pigs. People. Of course, you have people moving to the Americas. So the direction is from the old world to the new world for people. And predominantly, you have people from Europe and people from Africa. And then pathogens, of course, those are the pathogens that are going from the old world to the new world, particularly smallpox, leading to the devastating effects on population in the Americas. But we also have syphilis, which is going from the old world to the new world and leading to a lot of bad things there as well. So that's Spain. Now, one last thing that I had forgotten up here. Remember Spanish colonization in the north versus in the south. So in the south, Spanish colonization in Mexico, since they had been used to a confederation of city-states with one centralized city kind of controlling and dictating what happened, when the Spanish do come in and dominate the Aztec people later on, after destroying the Aztec civilization, the people in Mesoamerica were kind of used to that kind of centralized rule. So it was almost just replacing the Aztec rulers now with Spanish rulers. But for the most part, not a lot changed. They were already used to being controlled by another group. I mean, definitely it intensified. The exploitation intensified. It got worse. But they were kind of used to that kind of structure. That's not to say there weren't rebellions. There were. People were fighting back all the time. But there was more acceptance of Spanish colonial rule in Mexico. When the Spaniards try to colonize the southwestern portion of the United States, they encounter a different type of group of people. Here, remember, they're encountering tribal groups, similar to what the Islamic civilizations encountered in North Africa with the Berber traders. And anytime you're encountering tribal-based groups who are fiercely independent, who are not used to a centralized governmental structure, you're going to have a lot more difficulty controlling those tribes. And remember the revolt that's going to occur, the Pueblo Revolt, which is one of the only successful colonial rebellions or colonial revolts in all of world history. Of course, ultimately, the Spanish are able to dominate the Amerindians in the southern part of the United States. But for that brief moment, the Pueblo Revolt, they were successful in keeping the Spanish at bay. Okay, so after Spain, the next group to come over to the Americas were the Dutch. This is in the 1600s, and the Dutch are really, really unique because they settle in New Amsterdam, which becomes New York City. They settle there, but they're not concerned in really staying there. They don't want to settle. Everybody else wants to settle in one way or another. The Dutch are just there to trade. Unlike everybody else, too, they don't want to convert anybody. They don't care what religion you are. They just want to set up a trade relationship. So the Dutch are in the Americas, but they're in the Americas very briefly. They end up selling New Amsterdam to England, and England is going to take over, of course, the eastern portion of the United States then later on. But that's all you really need to know about the Dutch in New Amsterdam, New York City. After the Dutch, the French are going to come into the Americas. They're going to be the next to enter. They are entering and exploring in the 1600s and 1700s. They're going to settle predominantly in Canada and the Mississippi Valley. So this region right here, they're only going to have a lasting cultural impact in certain parts of Canada, Quebec, Quebecois, of course, still predominantly French-speaking. And then down here in New Orleans, with a lot of the Creole and blending syncretism that you see within the French and other cultural groups. So they are going to have some lasting cultural impact, but really only in these isolated locations. Unlike Spain, which is going to have a lasting cultural impact in every place that they colonize. In Mesoamerica, they still speak predominantly Spanish. They're still predominantly Catholic. So we see a lasting impact among the Spaniards, not so much among the French, except for in these two locations. Now, when they come over, they're looking to trade, similar to the Dutch, but trade in a more like kind of concrete way and with settlement. So they're focusing on fish and furs. Particularly, the wealth is going to be in the furs. So many animals are killed and the furs sent back to Europe. Europe had exhausted a lot of their animal resources, as well as the trees. We talked about deforestation in England. Europe, people had been living there for so long and had intensified agriculture and civilizations that they had basically destroyed their environment. So when they discover the Americas, the prevalence and abundance of animals and furs is going to be taken advantage of, and they do kind of have a devastating effect on the animal life here in the Americas as well. They're highly in collaboration. They're in high collaboration with the natives, and keep in mind they have to be, because the natives know where the good fishing locations are. The natives know the migratory patterns of the animals. So there's going to be a lot of collaboration, unlike the Spanish with the natives who want to dominate and exploit them for labor. The French want to trade, and so they collaborate with the native peoples. The first groups that come over, and pretty much the only groups that come over, are your traders and your missionaries. Your missionaries are your Jesuits. So your traders and your missionaries are coming over. And France attempts settlements, but they're not very successful at them, particularly because of the cold climate of the northern portions of North America. They want people to come, but frankly, they can't even pay them to come because the climate is so bad. And when word gets back about that, the French really end up not being successful with settlement, even though they wanted to be, because recall, the price revolution was going on in Europe, and there was pressure to get out of Europe because prices were rising, and wages were not. There was an abundance of people. Population was booming. So if you didn't want to work for low wages, they could just go out and find somebody else to do your job. So because of the population boom and the pressures of the price revolution, you're going to have a lot of people wanting to leave. But the French colonies, they just aren't. They'd rather stay in Europe than come to Canada. The Spanish have that same price revolution and population boom going on. And that's what's going to lead so many people to migrate during this second phase down here, later families. Keep in mind those families are coming because of those same factors I've just mentioned, the increasing population and the price revolution. Okay, so we did Spain, we did the Dutch, we did the French. The last bit is going to be the English. So the English are the last to come on the scene. England is late to the game here. So they're coming in the late 1600s and then throughout the 1700s. Families are the ones that are coming from the very, very beginning. And keep in mind why this is. A lot of the military conquering had already taken place. A lot of the devastation to the population had already taken place by this point. So the English didn't really need to send over a lot of warriors. The Americas were pretty much done for already. So families come over during this first stage, and they're coming for two reasons. First, the population and price revolution pressures that I just mentioned, but also for religious freedom. Remember what was happening in England. You have Anglicanism, and when Anglicanism developed, structurally, doctrinally, it really wasn't that different from Catholicism. So you still had a lot of centralized control in the religion, and they didn't allow for all of the other minor sects that had developed. So a lot of Puritan sects, the Quakers in with them, are going to leave because they're being persecuted back in England. And frankly, England was glad to see them go because they were troublemakers. They didn't adhere to the state religion, so the king was happy to see them go, and often granted large tracts of land in the Americas to those groups so they could do just that, leave. That's what happened with Pennsylvania with the Quakers. So when the Europeans come, when the English come to the Americas, unlike the Spaniards, they don't want to use the natives for labor. Unlike the French, they don't want to collaborate with them. They don't want to trade. We have whole families coming over now. They just want to settle. They want the land. In other words, they want the natives gone. They don't care how. They just want the natives gone, and they want their land. So that's the main goal when they come here, and they're quite successful at doing it. Now, remember the difference between what was happening in New England and what was happening further south in places like Pennsylvania. In New England, you have the Puritans, which had a very rigid, intolerant view of religion. So ironically, they were being persecuted because of intolerance in England, and when they come to the Americas, they're just as intolerant of other religious groups as England was of them. However, you see something really, really unique, and this is why I love that Spodek mentions it. You see something really unique developing in Pennsylvania among the Quakers. And the Quakers are some of the most modern, progressive groups to probably in all of world history. But when they come and establish Pennsylvania, they establish Pennsylvania with great tolerance. They establish it as a place, as a refuge for people of any faith, people of any background, so that you see such a diverse population coming to Pennsylvania, which is one of the things that allowed Pennsylvania to thrive for so much of its history. So that if you can compare the Puritans with the Quakers, we have intolerance and tolerance in very extreme forms going on simultaneously within the English colonies. I illustrate that to point out that there was great diversity within the colonies. Not all the colonies were identical. Not all of the colonies were insane. Were the same. Another kind of point of comparison is what you have just south of Pennsylvania in Maryland. Maryland was founded as a refuge for Catholics, who pretty much everybody else in the colonies hated, because remember, England had broken away from the Catholic Church, and a lot of people looked at the Catholic Church and the Pope with suspicion. So Maryland became a refuge for Catholics. So the English colonies are quite diverse. The next thing that you have to remember about England in the Americas, and this is the last thing that I want you to really focus on studying, is the whole aspect of indentured servitude and how that eventually is going to transition to slave laborers from Africa. So we have indentured servants coming over initially. These are white people from Europe who cannot pay their way over to the Americas. So they agree to work with people here in the English colonies for about 7 years until their debt is paid. But that was typically over and above what the debt was worth. So at the end of the 7 years, it was often the case that the indentured servant, when they were given their freedom, were also given money, and that enabled them to get started in the New World. Now, the system that developed here, though, was quite exploitative, so that it became almost a benefit that your indentured servant didn't live to the end of the 7 years. If you worked them very, very hard, got all the work out of them for the 7 years, but then they died, right before, you didn't have to pay them that cash wage. So we see a very, very, very harsh system of labor being created in indentured servants that are being brought over to the Americas, so much so that there are rebellions that occur. In addition to that, rebellions are also occurring because the indentured servants don't have access to land. And there's so much land in the Americas, they want not only wage, but they want a piece of land to start out on. So you see things like Bacon's Rebellion occurring. And what Bacon's Rebellion shows people in the Americas is that white European indentured servants can no longer be relied upon as a cheap source of labor that's just going to kind of lay back and do what you want them to do. They're going to fight back. So what you see happening in the English colonies after Bacon's Rebellion is a substantial decrease in indentured servitude, and now a substantial increase in the use of slaves from Africa. So this is when slaves really start to be imported into the South to work on plantations, such as the cotton plantations. So you have cotton being grown in the South, you have tobacco in the mid-Atlantic, and then fishing industries developing in the North. So that is the Americas. Now let's go to South America. We have two groups that are coming to play in South America. Let's begin with the Portuguese, because they are the ones who are exploring first. So the Portuguese colonized Brazil. And remember, they find it by accident. They establish sugar plantations, and the sugar plantations require so many slaves. Remember why? It's because of the harsh conditions on the plantations themselves. So many slaves are just like torn apart by this process, and they end up dying from malnutrition, from hard work, hard labor. So you see the importation of slaves really just increasing over time in Portuguese-controlled Brazil. At the same time, work on sugar plantations requires a lot of labor. So what you see with the increase in slaves coming from Africa is that at one point, about half of the population in Brazil is actually slaves, and then it increases later. Now, the Portuguese Empire in Brazil is going to come under threat when the Spaniards develop sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and then later the Brits do the same thing. The sugar plantations in the Caribbean are going to be highly competitive and actually start to chip away at the power of the sugar plantations that the Portuguese control in Brazil. So they are worried. And dumb luck once again kind of figures in here. And fortunately, in the interior of the country, they find gold and then they find diamonds. And this is what really saves Brazil as a Portuguese colony and maintains their power, because they find gold and diamonds in the interior. So initially it was sugar plantation that was generating all the wealth. Then when the Caribbean starts to be competition for that, they find gold and diamonds in the interior, and that's what saves them. In South America, the Spanish colonization that played out kind of was very similar to what you see among the Aztecs, so that we have internal disputes already. So there's a weak government. This time, though, it's not because of the city-state structure. In fact, the Incan Empire was not a city-state structure. It was a full-blown empire. The difficulty with the empire that they had established, though, is that so much of that power was invested in just that one individual, that when that one individual had been weakened, you now left the empire open and vulnerable. On top of that, there was a dispute, internal power dispute, over who would become the next leader. What had happened is that the smallpox, the diseases of the Columbian Exchange, had already begun to affect the Incan Empire before the Spanish were able to invade, and the original very powerful leader had been killed. This left two sons, and those two brothers begin to fight for power, to fight for control. The one who is successful is Atahualpa. So Atahualpa takes control of the Incan Empire, but by this point, there's already been a lot of internal fighting and internal struggle, so that when the Spanish come and invade the Incan Empire, it's already weak. It's already weakened because of this. On top of that, disease not only had killed the emperor, but has also had a devastating effect on the population. So you're already encountering a very weak population due to disease. Just like we saw in Mesoamerica, the Spanish then also have better weapons. And the final thing to know is how they actually gain control. So de Balboa is the first one who's actually going to cross the Isthmus of Panama up here, see the Pacific for the first time, and then the Spanish are going to start to expand further south because they hear rumors of gold in the Incan Empire, and they want that gold, of course. So Pizarro is going to be the conquistador that's able to come down and defeat the Incan Empire, and he does it through deception. So he sets up a meeting with Atahualpa, and Atahualpa agrees to come. And in the process of that meeting, Pizarro and his men, a small group of men, actually kidnap Atahualpa and keep him for ransom. They say that they will return Atahualpa if the Incan people will fill a room with gold, which they do. After which, when the Spaniards receive that, Pizarro then goes on to kill Atahualpa anyway, and they now have control over the Incan Empire. What do they set up down in the Incan Empire? So here's what we need to remember for South America regarding Spanish control. They set up forced labor systems as well. However, they're slightly different than what we see in the north. By the time they get down to the south, the hacienda system is really the only plantation system that has remained. So they set up particularly a hacienda system. They're also redoing the mita system. Spanish are quite brilliant here. They take something that the people are used to, the mita system, but now they tweak it to turn it into forced labor. And the only people who are benefiting from the mita system now are the Spaniards, whereas in the past, everyone had benefited from the mita system in building the roads and bridges and so forth. The last type of forced labor that you see in Spanish-controlled South America is Potosi. And Potosi is the silver mine. This is where they're employing a lot of child labor. Why? Because the little kids can crawl through all of those mine tunnels. So we see a comparison here with the Ottoman Empire use of children with devshirme. Now in the Ottoman Empire, they used kids because they could brainwash them. In Spanish-controlled South America, they're using them in the mines of Potosi because they are little and they physically can fit into the little mine shafts. The slave trade, most of it in South America is going to Brazil, not so much where the Incan Empire had been. It's mostly Portuguese that are importing slaves in South America. Mercantilism, this is really important. 80 to 90% of the gold and silver that was discovered in the New World, it's going to first go back to Europe, cause inflation, but then it's going to be shipped on to China. So China is receiving 80 to 90% of the gold and the silver being discovered in the Americas. So much so that at one point, Spanish currency, so the Mesoamerican peso, is going to be accepted as legal tender in China. And this is going to have a huge impact later on, of course, with saying why China won't industrialize. Why should they? They have all this money coming in. They don't really need to change anything about what they're doing. And then finally, for South America, Columbian exchange is impacting South America the same way as it is North America. You have a huge exchange of plants, particularly this is the potato coming from the Incan Empire going over to the New World. I should have said this, in Mesoamerica, it's not the potato. In Mesoamerica, it's maize, corn, that's being shipped over to the Old World that's having an impact. The potato, the origin of it is in the mountains of Peru and Chile. So the Incan Empire is the one who actually farmed the potato, and the potato is the one that's going to go to the old world and have that major impact. Animals, remember, they only have llamas in South America, so animals are going to impact the Americas more so than the old world. Nobody wants to import llamas in Europe or in Africa or in China. People, once again, is going to be people coming into South America from Europe and Africa. And then diseases, pathogens, of course, that's going to have a greater impact on the Americas than the old world because of the things like smallpox. The only exception being syphilis, which is the one that's going from the New World to the Old World. And I am going to take a break there. We will come back to do Africa and Asia, the last two parts of this second period, the Age of Exploration from 1450 to 1750. So we'll come back for a second part.